Okay, so the War of 1812 was fought between the United States and the British, but also between the United States and Canada. But why? Why did the Americans attack Canada? Well, there were two main reasons. The first was that the British had placed restrictions on American trade. In particular, they had placed restrictions on trade with France, which the Americans found galling since they were supposed to be neutral in this war. And on top of that, the British were forcing American sailors into the Royal Navy through a process known as impressment. So the Americans thought, let's go to war with Britain and we'll show them a thing or two. And as part of this, they decided to invade Canada because, well, it was connected to Britain by a lot of waterways and it seemed like an easy target. Unfortunately for them, Canada wasn't as easy as they expected. And so in 1813, after their first failed invasion, the Americans tried again, sending another army of about 10,000 men under the command of General Winfield Scott, who would lead them up through Lake Champlain, capture Montreal, and then from there, move on to Quebec City. Now, this strategy depended on the cooperation of the Americans' native allies, who were supposed to attack British positions from the rear. But at the Battle of Chrysler's, a battle that took place near present-day Ottawa, those native allies didn't show up, and so General Scott had to retreat back to the US. But while he was doing that, a third American force, one led by General Isaac Brock, was marching towards Lake Erie with orders to open up a second front against the British in Canada. Brock's force consisted of about 6,000 men, but only half of them were actual soldiers. The rest were militiamen. And those militiamen weren't exactly chomping at the bit to get into battle. So Brock spent a lot of time trying to drill his troops before he even made it to Lake Erie. Meanwhile, the British, hearing that these Americans were coming, sent Major General Henry Proctor with about 2,000 regulars to stop him. And they met up on September 10th, 1813, at the Battle of the Thames. And right off the bat, it looked like it was going to be a disaster for the Americans. Like the British opened up with a cannon barrage that killed Brock, who was actually quite popular as an officer, and nearly blew General Hull's arm off. On top of that, the American troops started panicking. Their militia officers were getting killed left and right, and nobody was stepping up to replace them. But then some reinforcements arrived, and they were able to stabilize the situation. Then when night fell, the Americans retreated. So overall, not a great victory for the Americans, but they didn't lose. And really what was important here is that they hadn't lost any ships. They still had a navy on Lake Erie, and with that navy, they could still threaten the British stronghold of Detroit. And so Proctor chose to retreat rather than risk being trapped there when the Americans came back. And that is exactly what happened. The Americans captured Detroit, and they held it until the end of the war. Meanwhile, far to the west, American forces were capturing Fort McHenry and Fort Niagara, pushing the British back on the Niagara frontier. And then, in December of 1813, American General George I. Hull crossed the frozen Niagara River and stormed Fort Erie, capturing it and all of its supplies. At this point, the Americans had complete control over Lake Erie, and the British were pushed back to the very western edge of their Canada. But despite that, the British were about to make their most impressive move of the entire war. In the summer of 1814, they launched a major counterattack, kicking the Americans out of Fort Erie, and then, in August, British troops seized Fort Detroit, and then, 3 weeks later, a British force of about 5,000 men crossed Lake Ontario and marched on to York, modern-day Toronto. At the time, York was the capital of Upper Canada, and its capture would be a huge propaganda victory for the Americans. But the British had other plans. They evacuated the city and then set fire to the Parliament building and other public buildings, before the Americans could capture them. And just like that, the British had managed to turn the tables on the Americans, and they weren't done yet. From York, the British marched east and captured Fort Niagara and Fort Oswego, retaking territory that the Americans had been occupying for years. For a moment, it looked like the British might push all the way to Lake Champlain and cut off American shipping lanes to the west coast. But the Americans stopped them at the Battle of the Chateauguay. So by the end of 1814, the British were back to where they had started. But wait, we aren't done yet, because in January of 1815, the Americans invaded again, this time sending General Andrew Jackson down to New Orleans with about 7,000 men to capture the city, which at the time was the largest city in the British North American colonies. Now, the British were expecting this attack, and so they had sent General Sir Edward Pakenham to defend the city. He had about 3,000 regular troops, but they were green, poorly equipped, and suffering from disease, so it wasn't much of a contest. The Americans attacked on January and within 20 minutes had completely routed the British, killing or wounding 2,000 of them and capturing 1,000 more, along with 40 cannons. It was the most lopsided American victory of the entire war. Okay, but the thing about the Battle of New Orleans is that it shouldn't have happened. You see, the Treaty of Ghent had been signed in December of 1814, and it basically said that nothing had changed. Like if you controlled territory at the start of the war, you got to keep it at the end. And because news traveled slowly in those days, Jackson didn't get the memo, and he attacked anyway. But even though the Battle of New Orleans was technically illegal, it went down in history as a major American victory and cemented Andrew Jackson's status as a national hero. Now, there were lots of reasons that the Americans were able to achieve this victory at New Orleans. Like the British were certainly inexperienced and sickly, but they were also fighting on unfamiliar terrain against troops that they had never seen before, and that was thanks to the 3,000 indigenous people that joined the Americans in their invasion. You see, during the war, the Americans had worked hard to forge alliances with various indigenous nations across the continent, promising them land and sovereignty in exchange for their support. And those promises were fulfilled after the war with the creation of the state of Oklahoma. But during the war, it helped the Americans out a lot. In particular, the Shawnee leader Tecumseh and his brother Tenskwatawa, also known as the Prophet, had created a confederacy of tribes that fought alongside the Americans. In fact, the Prophet was the one who convinced Jackson to attack the British at New Orleans. But while the Americans certainly appreciated the help, they also saw these indigenous nations as obstacles to their expansion, and after the war, they broke most of their promises to them. Okay, now the Americans didn't do too badly in the naval arena either. In particular, they had a lot of success on the Great Lakes. See? The Americans had a monopoly on Lake Erie, and the British had a monopoly on Lake Ontario and Lake Huron, but the British had hoped to use that monopoly to choke off American supply lines to the west, and they did manage to do that for a little while. But ultimately, the Americans were able to break the British blockade and supply their western forts, preventing them from falling into British hands. Likewise, the Americans also built a small navy on the Great Lakes, in particular on Lake Ontario, where they engaged the British in a number of bloody battles. In one of these battles, in particular, the American ship the Ontario fought against the British ship the St. Lawrence and managed to outmaneuver and outgun them, forcing them to surrender. But while the Americans had successes on the Great Lakes, the British had successes elsewhere. In particular, the Royal Navy was dominant on the seas, and when it came to winning battles against the US Navy, they were undefeated. But even though the British won every single battle, they didn't really have all that much to brag about. That's because most of these battles involved fighting against American privateers, who used fast maneuverable ships to harass the British, and so most of the battles were inconclusive. For instance, in the Battle of Lake Erie, the British flagship was captured, but a British privateer captured the flagship of the American squadron, so it kind of just ended up being a draw. And overall, that's how you could describe the War of 1812. Neither side was able to gain any territory. And so the question is, then, what was it about? Well, the answer is kind of complicated. The British gave up impressment in 1812, so that wasn't it. And American expansionism did play a role, but it wasn't the whole story. Like, yes, the Americans wanted to expand, but they were also defending their territorial integrity against a powerful invader. And I think that's something that Canadians can relate to today. In fact, I think the War of 1812 played a big role in forging Canadian identity. You see, prior to 1812, Upper Canada and Lower Canada had been part of a single colony called British North America, but during the war, they were defended separately, and each developed their own committee system for governing themselves. Those committees became the legislative assemblies for the two provinces, and after the war, those two provinces, along with the island of Newfoundland, were united into the single province of Canada. So I guess what I am saying is that the War of 1812 may not have been about Canadian independence, but it sure did help create Canada. Anyway, if you want to learn more about the War of 1812, click right here.